All right, guys, we're back, ready to mix some more vintage sounding hip hop beats in Ableton Live. So I'm still working with this track by Cooper Lee and my man Zach. So today we're going to focus on the basses. Previously we did vocals and some overall track organization, and we'll probably come back to the vocals in a future episode as well. It's sort of a never-ending struggle with mixing vocals. So now the basses, this is what we've got, both the track leading up to it and when the bass drops.
Yo. 1, 2. Hey, everybody! Come on!
There's a folklore legend claiming death's the next of kin. Fuck that message, hope the mess never begins.
All right, so you see what the bass is trying to do there. I think it's a pretty decent bass, but it's got these three levels, these three layers to it, and that's the thumb bass, the Bofner, and the hip hop sub. That's them together. So let's just see what I would do with these guys. I think first of all, I mentioned in a previous episode that these didn't have to all be separate MIDI tracks. You could do them in an instrument rack. I'm just going to illustrate that real quick, but I'll probably just go back and leave them like it is because it's not that important. I don't think there'd be any particular advantage to it once the track is already composed. It's just nice when you're only dealing with just constructing one MIDI line instead of having to always duplicate it. So this is what that would look like. So let me whatever this instrument is, I'll just take that as read. Anything that's done here, we'll just call that a creative decision. And yeah, that's what we want. We want the thumb bass here, and then this Bofner bass. Grab that guy. Bass roundups are really fun bass preset. I'm glad I used that. That often leads to good things. So let me just paste that instrument in here. So now we've got a second layer here, and our sub. Throw that in there. And these have got separate levels here. Looks like this one, the original thumb bass was on -5 relatively, and Bofner was at -12. That won't be the end of the story, I'm sure. And the hip hop sub at about -8. So that'll start us out at least where we were. So if I did that right, then this combined instrument should sound the same now that I've muted these two as they all did together. Yeah, so that's the idea, and then we only have one MIDI track to be concerned of. So that's something to keep in mind. Do that when you want. The situations vary these days, and I'm sure like in a year I'll do it differently than I do now, of when I want multiple tracks and when I want just one. Just to make it easier so you can see all three of them up here, I'm gonna undo what I just did there though. All right, so we're back where we were. They are sorry if that's confusing. They're back as three separate tracks now, and we can still put stuff on all of them because they're all in this one group, and so we can add bus effects if we want, and we certainly will in a little while. But first, let's just get them all playing a little more nicely. So always think when you mix tracks together about like what part of the frequency are they really operating. I love Ableton's EQ8 in the later versions because it's got this spectrum analysis just built in. Let me show you what I mean. So if you don't have that version, you could still get a spectrum to show up separately, but this is like super helpful. Now let's just look at these spectrums of these different basses. The thumb bass. Okay, now let's see where the sub is occupying. hopefully sub ranges, right? You'd hope that that's what's going on. And for the most part it is. And I'm going to speculate that like what's up here is probably just noise. Let's just cut that stuff off, roll that off, and yeah, so we could do just the subs or give it a little more room, whatever there. But anything that is going to contribute out here is just going to probably be not as good as what these other more intricate basses are doing. All right, Bofner, let's see what you got. All right, so the first thing you notice is that the two non-sub basses are occupying the sub range probably unnecessarily. If you don't have a dedicated sub bass, then yeah, you better leave the sub ranges in your bass. But if you are, especially if they're all synth basses, you probably should just let the sub bass do its job and not have the other ones trounce over it. So let's low cut the subs out of the other two basses. All right, now the thumb. Now, hopefully, if this should already be sitting better once we put it back together. If you were to listen to it, on something with bass, your laptop speakers are probably not going to even notice a difference here. A little more room for that sub. We might be able to turn it up even. And stuff like that, frequency kind of jigsaw puzzles are a lot of what's going to make a song really, really bang when there's a sub. And also just sound good on a wider range of systems. And that is what mixing is all about. Now, there's another thing going on here, which is that the thumb bass is kind of doing the same job as the Bofner bass. Let's just put the hip-hop sub at the bottom, because sub's lower. That's easy to remember. Now, this Bofner is got some lows and some mids, and this one also has. It's usually the case that two instruments, probably shouldn't be occupying the same range like that, and one of them's probably doing part of it better. If we're going to keep both of these, and I don't see any reason not to keep them both, then perhaps they ought to split the duties somehow. So let's see. See what we feel about the low end of this thumb bass. It's a nice low end. What's the high end sound like? I kind of like that acoustic strummy sound that it's got. So let's look at the Bofner's two halves. So let's try just taking, listen to the low end of this one more time. I don't think that's a very strong low end. It's just kind of shrill and whiny. So let's try making the Bofner more about this area. Taking a little mid out of it too. Yeah, so that's maybe more isolating the useful parts of that Bofner bass, and maybe the lows above the sub range are better handled by this thumb bass. So we did lose a little bit of the articulation of the strumming up here. We could certainly bring that back if we wanted, but let's see how these sound together now.
Quote the Raven, never once again kick that.
And I think on this track, like a more subdued bass is probably a good thing. More, not a whole lot of these sort of grungy effects coming in, intruding into all the rich upper end that we've got going. So while I do like that, I'm going to take kind of a less is more approach there. So these guys are a little more in harmony now, not literal musical harmony, but they're frequency happy, and maybe will more function as one instrument. I'm going to turn off those 3 EQs real quick, just so you can see how much more cohesive it is. Yeah, that's like almost a song already just with those 3 bass tracks there. There's a lot going on, and like the bass should probably just be the bass. I do like that articulation on the thumb bass, though. Let's bring back some of that. All right, so what else, I hear you asking? What else can we do to make this more cohesive together? Well, they're all going to this group effects bus, as I keep saying. So usually when you put 2-3 instruments together like this, you often want to put some common effects on them. A common thing to do is, like, maybe not so much with a bass, but putting the same reverb on a group of things makes them sound more like a unit. Not a great idea with bass. A compressor is, I think, what we're going to do next here. And also you see the same saturator being put on a group. It makes them gel a little bit. So let's try that. All right, that's cool. And a top level track, I'm going to throw a limiter on just because that's what I like to do. Remove what we added immediately. So take this down to -10 or so. Yeah. All right. So we won't do the saturators just yet, but I'm going to now get into something which is really useful for processing instruments in general and basses especially. The EDM community, probably does this in every single track ever nowadays. In hip hop, it's a little lesser known, I think, but what I'm going to do is do a something we'll call it like split processing on a bass. So I'm going to give different, not only are we bringing these all together and putting some effects on all of them, I'm now going to split that combined signal by frequency and put slightly different processing on different ranges of the frequency, which is something that Cooper specifically was asking me about in terms of getting basses to sound good without screwing up the sub range. There's a lot of effects sound really great in a bass. You put an amp on a bass, it's awesome, but you've now destroyed your sub. Well, split processing is kind of the answer to all of that. So let's do that. And oftentimes, I think I've got a preset that I use for that most of the time that I just made one day. User library presets. Yeah, the Pompey 3-band rack. There we go. But you probably don't have Pompey 3-band rack in your library, so let's show you how to make it. Say to make something like that. So what would we do if we just wanted to see part of the spectrum in this grouped bass? We take out an EQ8. I almost never use an EQ3, honestly, even if I'm just doing a simple low or high cut. The EQ8 is kind of where it's at. And let's say I just want the sub range. Well, let's do that 4x cutoff, and some people like don't even think the 4x is steep enough, so they'll like put two of them together, make it even steeper. That's a little extra tip, no charge. I'm not gonna do that because my ear's honestly not good enough to tell if that's really necessary on a bass. So now we've got just the sub range. Let's see. That's a sub range, all right. And that's not where it ends, obviously. I'm going to Command G these. Just like you can group tracks, you can group effects and instruments for that matter, as we saw earlier. So let's say this is the sub. If that's the sub, something's probably the low. So I dragged one down here to add one. I can also just create another chain and then add stuff to it. And the mid, and you know, sometimes you do low, mid, high. In this case, sub, low, mid. There's not really a high to be spoken of, so the mids can be the highs as well on this particular breakdown for a bass. So that's cool. And this sub cutoff point, I also want to use that point to be where the lows start, where the subs stop, the lows start. Well, we don't have to just keep those in sync. We can map that to a macro. So let's call that macro subcross. Or even sub low cross. And 100 hertz or whatever is a good starting point for that. Now we can map this one to the same one. Awesome. So now those two will change together. And if we've got a sub low cross, we probably need a low mid cross. And we'll see once we listen to this particular sound what we're going to consider mid in this situation. I always establish a lot of abbreviations because you don't get a lot of space in the labels. Let's call this audio rack our splitter while we're naming stuff. Bass splitter, awesome. And then this low mid crossover is good there. So then the mids should also have an EQ8 and start where the lows ended. So let's take that frequency knob, map it to the low mid crossover. You can turn the rest of these guys off. They don't really need to be doing anything. All right. That's cool. Let's see what these sound like. Now we can solo them, you know. So let's solo them and see what the different bands of this bass sound like. All right, I've got these roughly where I feel like the sub, low, and mid elements are in this particular instrument. It's kind of a just use your ear thing, like everything. And what should we be putting on these? The sub, you should put almost nothing on. If this were a live bass that we were recording and bringing in information as opposed to like a synth bass, I would say be extra careful, like to let's make sure that it's not There's no panning in it. Let's make sure that it's mono. Bass should. Everyone seems to agree that bass ought to be mono. So that's something you might put on a sub. This is probably, the hip hop sub probably knows enough not to be panning left and right and be wide anyway, but a little zero width would make sure of that. But in general, the sub is kind of, it's being separated out just so it gets left alone, and we want to process the other guys. So let us do that. Let's see what the lows might like. Let's try a saturator on that. And a bit warmer is the one I usually start with when I want to just do general purpose mixing. And something that is a little bit tricky about saturators is they immediately like lift the level of things if you got the drive. And this is commonly, if you just hear something is louder, you're going to assume, oh, that improved it. Well, not necessarily. It maybe just turned it up. So I always turn the output down by the same amount that I'm running up the drive roughly. And then I can tell sort of more objectively if I like what's being done to the sound. Turn it on and off. And usually I want it to hit this line on the saturator at some point, because the saturator is just like a very interesting limiter. It's one that like does more interesting things when you clip. So this would be the clip point. If you don't hit that, then the saturator's not doing a whole heck of a lot. That sounds a little bit cooler, I guess. Let's try the mids. They could also probably use a saturator. And we could play with that till the cows come home for sure. And something that's nice on a bass sometimes is a chorus. We're not going to go like crazy with it to the point we would in some other genres maybe, or even just some other kinds of hip hop. But this is where a split bass processor is really nice, because you don't want to put like a chorus on the whole bass, or even if you want chorus on a lot of it, maybe a different chorus on the mids as the lows, for instance. But don't put a chorus on your sub. That's kind of why it's split out, to protect it from stuff like that. You see, it sounds wider, and just a little bit of that will just will make the bass sound wider, which is nice because we're dealing with a synthetic bass. It doesn't quite sound real, so that helps a little bit. Put it all together. Always making these decisions in the greater mix. I think it has that sort of more. It has the right amount of effect at maybe 30% or so. Not a final decision, to be sure. So we've done that. And this is also where you could be adding, bass amps. These already have amps on them, so I'm not going to put like more amps on them. But, if you were doing a split processing, that's a great place to experiment with just putting an amp on the lows or whatever. And another interesting thing to know is like you do all these crazy effects. Well, certain ones of them you want to put actually below the actual frequency split, before it, that is to say, to the left. Saturator on amp, you definitely would. And the reason I'm doing that is because these effects, especially an amp, I'm just doing a saturate or illustrate, would add harmonics. It's going to add harmonics to places outside of this range, and you really, now this is no longer confined to that point. So you sometimes want to put the cutoff after. Anyway, now we've got a pretty well behaved bass. Let's start processing the end result of that. And see where we're at. I'm going to expand this guy and we can see the frequencies a little better. A lot of high frequency information here. I'm going to see what happens if we roll that off. So it depends on what kind of track, whether we're going to want something more like this or something richer. Maybe somewhere in between. And so let's listen to that track. Let's put in the strings and the drums and see how this harmonizes. So I would have thought we didn't need a lot of that kind of twanging energy of the bass, but because the rest of the track is so dense, it gets easy to actually lose the bass, and it's kind of contradictory. Like it's paradoxical, I could say, when my mind tells me I want is the bass to go up. You'd think I want to pump this stuff up, but it's already pretty loud. What I really should probably be doing is finding elements of the bass that that sort of enforce the fact that the bass is happening. So sometimes to make the low bass sound good, you do need an enhanced upper section of the bass. Let's see if maybe we can create a little more impression of the bass with that. Make this a little thinner. I'm going to adjust the Q. Okay, so I think maybe that will help the bass overall assert itself more in the mix. Let's see. Might have helped. I'm just trying to show you the different weapons that are in the arsenal, And you've got to, at the end of the day, use your ear, turn things on and off, play with them, and try to be as scientific as you can be. Because ultimately, if we're not careful, we'll just hear what we expect to hear. Another important thing to do that I would be doing if I were, not recording a podcast right now, is I would take earbuds and I would plug them in, and I would put down my nice Sony monitor headphones here and listen to this track in some crude earbuds and see, is the bass sounding right in that too? Is it sounding right on laptop speakers? I do some comparisons, because it's one thing. Although flat monitors is maybe the best single thing to try something on, you're never really going to know how it's going to deal with lower end systems that don't have a lot of bass, and if it's still going to sound balanced unless you actually try that regularly sort of throughout the mixdown process. So that's another good weapon for your arsenal. I think that we're in a pretty good spot with this bass. There's a lot, we could be doing more aggressive effects with these saturators and so forth and really squashing it, but I don't think the track is calling for that, really.
Truth.
So that'll do for now. All right, guys, that is just the fundamentals of split bass processing in Ableton for all your hip hop needs.